Hello, and welcome back to the 15th instalment of my failed franchises series. In this series, I look at whether defunct rail franchises should be deemed as failed, whether this be their contract being stripped from them or their franchise simply being deemed poor by the public and industry. In today's video, I'll look at the third privatised intercity East Coast franchise operator, East Coast, and how they were perhaps wrongly stripped as an operator. But can they truly be classified as a failed franchise? That's what I'll discuss in today's video. Do ensure you subscribe so you don't miss the other episodes of this East Coast Mainline mini-series, and do check out my other failed franchises videos. Thank you. Firstly, let's look at how East Coast became an operator. Well, to fully understand the situation, you must watch my previous videos on GNER and National Express East Coast. National Express East Coast collapsed in November 2009 due to the company being unable to pay back the £1.4 billion debt it owed to the DfT, and there was a similar story to the previous GNER operator. Instead of confirming the re-tendering of the franchise and allowing bidders to bid for the franchise, the DfT confirmed that the franchise would be state-run for a few years before being re-privatised, a move supported by many in the rail industry, including the RMT, who believed that a nationalised operator could bring benefits. The Department for Transport confirmed that the new nationalised operator, East Coast, would be in the public hands until at least 2011. And on the 14th of November 2009, National Express East Coast transferred all services, staff and stations to the new East Coast company. East Coast operated regular services from London King's Cross towards Leeds, York, Newcastle, Edinburgh and Glasgow, via stations such as Peterborough and Doncaster. Services from King's Cross to Leeds and Newcastle were operated both half-hourly, with an hourly service to Edinburgh forming the flagship route operated by East Coast, as well as hourly services to Newark and extended to York once every 2 hours. East Coast also ran less frequent minor routes from London towards Hull, Bradford, Lincoln, Skipton, Harrogate, Aberdeen and Inverness, with these routes usually being operated just once or twice a day. Overall, around 6 East Coast trains per hour departed London King's Cross off-peak. As for rolling stock, East Coast would inherit all of the National Express East Coast 225 sets for the electric services up towards Edinburgh, as well as 32 Class 43s, along with 117 Mark III coaches for the non-electrified services, such as those to Hull. As for operations then, people weren't expecting an awful lot from East Coast, and indeed, the managing company set up by the Department for Transport to manage East Coast, named Directly Operated Railways, suggested that they would not be doing a huge amount of interference to the operations. However, East Coast were given a huge financial investment in terms of staff and assets, such as station upgrades. One thing that East Coast did do that National Express were unsuccessful at was rebranding. National Express were only able to apply their livery to HSTs and one Class 91 locomotive, but East Coast successfully repainted their whole fleet beginning from June 2010. The livery was basic, featuring a simple light grey body paint across both the 225 and 125 sets, with a purple line across the entire length of the sets, with the East Coast logo and website featured on carriages. Overall, the livery was quite basic, so the next operator didn't have to do too much to implement their livery of choice. Remember, East Coast was only a temporary operator and was only meant to last a few years. Even with this simplicity in mind, the livery was sleek and smart, and executed efficiently, providing a new brand for travel on the East Coast, and finally removing GNER branding that was last relevant in 2007. However, it wasn't all good news for East Coast regarding their fleet. The fleet itself was getting old, and this was noted by passengers, with the fleet last receiving refurbishments under the GNER Mallard programme. However, this continued under National Express East Coast for some HST sets. In 2010, the first change of note occurred on East Coast, the implementation of Wi-Fi charges, which, for standard class passengers, went from being free of charge to £4.99 an hour, or £9.99 per day. This coincided with Wi-Fi upgrades in 2011, costing £600,000 to implement satellite and 3G uplinks to provide Wi-Fi signal throughout the journey, perhaps a trade standard class passengers were willing to make for giving up free Wi-Fi. Elsewhere in 2010, in November, East Coast finally announced the reintroduction of free meals in first class, which was removed under National Express East Coast. The operator confirmed it would invest £10 million in upgrading its catering and attempt to bring it back to standards seen under GNER previously, with a full hot breakfast, lunch and evening meal offered, including complimentary wines, spirits, beers and soft drinks. However, the upgrade did not include weekend travel, where a £25 onboard upgrade would not include hot meals. Instead, an all-day light menu would be offered, which perhaps put off passengers. Regardless, East Coast believed that the new catering in first class could generate upwards of £23 million a year, making the £10 million spent seemingly to be good value on the taxpayer. In 2011, the largest change on East Coast occurred. These Wi-Fi and catering upgrades came with a larger announcement, the new May 2011 Eureka timetable. East Coast announced the plans in late 2010, and the new timetable will be the biggest change to the East Coast Mainline timetable in about 20 years, and would see 20 more services per weekday, more weekend services and faster journey times with regular service patterns. The timetable would also see a new Flying Scotsman London to Edinburgh service, a 225 set being used on the Skipton services, as well as a new London to Lincoln daily service. All in all, the upgrades would provide more than 3 million extra seats per year, coinciding with the news of passenger growth totalling to 4.2% per year. The May 2011 timetable was a huge success, promoting rail travel on the East Coast Mainline, with many believing that the new nationalised operator was performing much better than the previous privatised ones, with the cheap flat fare £10 one-way tickets and announcements of £24 Olympic special tickets also boosting passenger satisfaction. Some people believed a nationalised operator wouldn't have the freedom versus privatised ones, but this wasn't the case. In August 2010, East Coast announced plans to attempt to test a Class 390 Pendolino on the East Coast Mainline, with a potential new Pendolino order coming if the test was successful to replace the 225 sets. Unfortunately, the plans were sadly scuppered by Virgin West Coast, who suggested East Coast were trying to take passengers away from them by trying to get new Pendolinos before Virgin, who had already ordered 4 more new units, and thus the scheme never actually got as far as the drawing board. But East Coast still wanted to innovate and boost capacity in time for the 2012 Olympics, and that should be praised. 2011 was certainly a busy year for East Coast, as he introduced a new loyalty system, which was points-based. The system, which gave points for purchasing any rail tickets from the East Coast website, gave passengers perks such as free travel and covered season tickets and business travel. This was a huge upgrade from the previous Escape scheme, which was really targeted only at high spenders. In 2012, it was confirmed that East Coast was one of the most successful operators in Great Britain at the time. By 2012, East Coast had received 13 industry awards, including Britain's Top Employer Award. Ticket sales had risen by over 4% each year, and the taxpayer was gaining £208 million from the operator due to it being hugely profitable. As well as this, East Coast received a record level of customer satisfaction and averaged well over 85% of services arriving on time, peaking at 95% between 2012 and 2013. To make things better, East Coast was far cheaper to run, against an operator like Virgin West Coast, which received £180 million in government revenue support since 2009, plus a £1.2 billion network grant. East Coast received no revenue support and just a £980 million network grant, despite running a network nearly as long as Virgin's and just as important. Elsewhere in 2012 and early in 2011, East Coast decided to restart the tradition of naming locomotives, giving names to 4 Class 91s, including 91110, painting it to a Battle of Britain commemorative livery. A year later, in 2013, something rather interesting and strange happened. Sky One produced a series on East Coast titled All Aboard East Coast Trains, where they depicted how the company works, from the onboard staff to mechanics in the depots. In partnership with Sky, East Coast also provided a full 225 set and Class 91, 91125 with a new Sky One HD livery, including some of the characters on the series. 2013 was also a big year for the future of East Coast. The initial date that the DfT had suggested for the end of the franchise was December 2013, moved from 2011. However, this was then extended again until February 2015, with bidding to begin in 2014. Despite the extension, many, including the RMT union, were puzzled as to why the DfT didn't consider keeping East Coast nationalised permanently. They argued that the operator was highly profitable, had high customer satisfaction, and provided good value for money. Despite this, the reprivatisation of the franchise still happened, with then Transport Secretary Patrick McLaughlin suggesting he wanted to see a revitalised East Coast Railway. Many, however, suggested one already existed. On the other hand, East Coast had not delivered the new fleet that the East Coast Mainline desperately needed. The HSTs were now heading towards their 40th birthday, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the fleet of East Coast was starting to show its age. The interiors, without refurbishment since 2007, were also becoming dated, with even the Wi-Fi being deemed slow, only having 3G despite 4G being introduced back in 2009. The Mark III HSTs were also becoming outdated in terms of interior ambience, with PA usually never working, sporadic heating, and vestibule doors that failed to open or close, not to mention the use of slammed doors, which weren't very accessible. However, the Intercity Express programme was going to replace all HSD stock and some of the 225 sets, but this was not looking to be something that was introduced within the next few years, with the first front carriage only being unveiled in Japan in 2014 by Hitachi. Thus, it's a shame East Coast let Smoke's fleet deteriorate. Regardless, they would not be an operator for much longer, so they probably weren't too fussed about these issues, management at least. In January 2014, First Group, Keolis and Eurostar, as well as Stagecoach and Virgin, were announced as the bidders for the new franchise. Stagecoach and Virgin won the franchise in November 2014, but not without the backlash. The TSSA Rail Union suggested that East Coast had been a success story and called the privatisation an economic vandalism, and they probably weren't wrong. On the 1st of March 2015, East Coast slid into the history books, replaced by Virgin Trains East Coast on a 7-year franchise. They would be the operator to bring the new fleet into service. Or so they thought. Even the day of Virgin beginning operations was not met without backlash, with protests happening across the country due to the privatisation, with many angered and wanting to see East Coast remain as an operator. In conclusion then, East Coast, a nationalised operator that seemed to do a much better job than its predecessor and successor, an operator that only failed because the Department for Transport didn't want to keep it nationalised, and clearly didn't learn from National Express East Coast or GNER. Why re-privatise? Well, who knows? Probably because it was a Conservative Party that was pro-privatisation and going through huge austerity cuts. So, is East Coast a failed franchise? Legally? Well, probably. It did technically lose its operations, but never had set contracts or targets to achieve due to it being ran directly by the government. Personally though, I think it definitely was not failed. They managed to successfully make a franchise many thought impossible to make profitable. They brought value to the taxpayer and provided a reliable and relatively good service to many. It's just a shame that the Department for Transport decided to re-privatise the franchise, making services much worse for passengers. So then, what do you think overall? Am I being fair on East Coast, too harsh, or too lenient? Let me know in the comments below. Also let me know if you have any memories of East Coast. Did you watch the documentary on Sky, or did you actually go on the operator? Also let me know in the comments. While you're at it, do like and subscribe, and check out my other failed franchises videos whilst you're at it. Special thanks to my first class member, Callum, Martyn, and my business owned members, Andrew Bowen, Anthony Howes, and Craig Mitchell 43. Also thanks to Dever Rooney for his donations and membership. If you would like, you can join my membership by pressing the join button from as little as £2.99 a month, or you can donate to me by clicking on the love heart or the thanks button at the bottom of the video. Thanks so much for watching. Check out my Twitter, Discord and Instagram in the links below, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.